He thought humiliating her would be entertaining, but in less than a minute, the entire room would realize they had just misjudged the most dangerous kind of woman, the quiet one. The marble floors of the Whitmore Institute reflected the warm glow of chandelier light as conversations echoed in polished tones, professors in tailored suits, investors sipping sparkling water, and students whispering theories they barely understood, all gathered for what was supposed to be an untouchable man's moment of brilliance. At the center stood Dr. Leonard Hayes, a man whose reputation filled rooms before he even entered them, known for dismantling arguments with a smile and reducing people to silence with a single sentence. And tonight, he was in full control, pacing slowly across the stage with the confidence of someone who had never been publicly challenged. Near the back of the hall, almost blending into the shadows between two tall columns, stood Clara Whitmore, dressed in a simple gray cardigan and modest slacks, her posture straight but unassuming, her presence so quiet it barely registered, the kind of woman people looked through rather than at. No one asked her name, no one offered a greeting, and when she took a small step forward to see the board more clearly, a pair of graduate students subtly shifted to block her view, as if her curiosity itself was out of place. She didn't react, didn't argue, just adjusted her stance and watched, her eyes steady, absorbing every word, every flaw, every assumption being made in that room. Dr. Hayes continued, his voice smooth and measured, presenting a problem he had labeled unsolvable under current models, pausing just long enough for admiration to settle over the audience like a shared agreement that no one here would dare question him. And that's when it happened, a small voice from the back, calm but clear, cutting cleanly through the air. There's a gap in your fourth step. The room shifted, not loudly, but noticeably, like a ripple across still water, heads turning, brows tightening, attention snapping toward the source of interruption. Dr. Hayes stopped mid-sentence, his expression freezing for just a fraction of a second before reshaping into something sharper, something amused. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Clara, and for a brief moment, he simply looked at her, taking in the cardigan, the simplicity, the audacity. A faint smile formed, the kind reserved for people he had already decided were beneath him. "And you are?" he asked, his tone light, but edged with something colder. Clara didn't move forward yet, didn't shrink either, just met his gaze with a quiet steadiness that didn't match the role everyone had already assigned to her. "Clara," she said simply. A few scattered chuckles rose from the crowd, not loud, but enough to signal what everyone was thinking. Just Clara. No title, no credentials, no importance. Dr. Hayes let out a soft breath through his nose, glancing briefly at the audience, as if inviting them to enjoy what was about to unfold. "Well, Clara," he said, stepping aside with a gesture toward the board. "Why don't you come up here and show us what we're all missing?" The room leaned forward, anticipation building, not for brilliance, but for embarrassment, for confirmation that the hierarchy remained intact. And as Clara took her first step down the aisle, the sound of her shoes against the marble seemed louder than it should have been, each step measured, unhurried, as if she wasn't walking into a trap, but into something she had been waiting for all along. And in that moment, though no one realized it yet, the balance of the room had already begun to shift. Clara's footsteps echoed softly as she moved toward the front, each step steady, unhurried, completely at odds with the tension tightening across the room, and the closer she got, the more the atmosphere shifted from amusement to something quieter, more uncertain, though no one was ready to admit it yet. Dr. Hayes watched her approach with a faint smile still resting on his face, but there was a flicker behind his eyes now, a brief calculation, as if he were trying to understand why she did not look nervous, why her shoulders were not tense, why her gaze did not drop to the floor like everyone else who had stood where she was about to stand. When she reached the stage, she paused just long enough to glance at the board, not scanning, not guessing, but recognizing, as if she had seen this problem long before tonight, as if it belonged to a language she already spoke fluently. A low murmur rippled through the audience, subtle but present, the kind of sound that comes when expectation begins to crack, and Dr. Hayes gestured lightly toward the equation, his voice calm but edged. "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite, as though he expected her to hesitate, to falter, to confirm what everyone already believed. Clara stepped closer to the board, her hand reaching for the marker without hesitation, and for a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath, the quiet stretching just enough to become noticeable, just enough to feel deliberate. She did not rush, did not perform, did not look back at the audience for reassurance. She simply began, her movements precise, controlled, almost effortless, writing line after line with a clarity that felt unsettling in its simplicity. The first few strokes drew polite attention, the kind given to someone trying. But as the structure of her solution began to take shape, that attention shifted, sharpened, people leaning forward slightly, eyes narrowing, trying to follow what she was doing and why it felt different from anything they had just seen. Dr. Hayes' expression changed almost imperceptibly, the confidence in his posture tightening, his arms folding slowly across his chest as he watched, no longer amused, no longer relaxed. Clara continued without pause, adjusting a variable, restructuring a step, not correcting the problem but reframing it entirely, as though the limitation he had presented never existed in the first place. A chair creaked somewhere in the back, louder than it should have been, and then even that sound disappeared into the growing silence. When she reached the fourth step, the one she had mentioned, she stopped for just a moment, her hand hovering. Then with a small, deliberate motion, she erased a single line and replaced it with something cleaner, something undeniable, and in that instant, something in the room shifted completely. One of the graduate students who had laughed earlier straightened abruptly, his expression tightening as he realized what he was seeing, while another whispered something under his breath, quickly silenced by the weight of the moment. Clara finished the final line without flourish, placing the marker down with the same quiet control she had carried from the back of the room, then stepped slightly aside, giving the board back to the man who had invited her there. Dr. Hayes did not speak immediately, his eyes fixed on the solution, scanning, searching, trying to find the flaw that would restore the balance he had lost. But the longer he looked, the more the silence deepened, pressing in from every corner of the room, until even the air seemed to pause, waiting for him to say something, anything. And for the first time that night, the man who had never been questioned stood completely still, his certainty unraveling in front of everyone. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and the silence that filled the hall was no longer polite or uncertain. It was heavy, undeniable, pressing against every person in the room as if demanding acknowledgement of what had just happened. Dr. Hayes remained fixed in place, his eyes locked on the board, tracing the lines Clara had written as though repetition might expose a mistake. But each pass only confirmed the same conclusion. The structure held, the logic was clean, and more unsettling than anything else. It was elegant in a way his original model had not been. A faint shift in the audience broke the stillness, someone adjusting in their seat, another leaning forward, and then a whisper, quickly hushed, but enough to signal that the perception of the room had changed. Clara did not rush to fill the silence. She did not explain, did not defend. She simply stood a step away from the board, hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm, almost detached, as if the outcome had never been in question for her. Dr. Hayes finally exhaled, a controlled breath that sounded louder than it should have, and straightened slightly, attempting to reclaim the authority that had defined him only minutes before. "Interesting approach," he said, his voice measured, but lacking the ease it once carried, as though each word now required intention. He stepped closer to the board, pointing at a section of Clara's solution, searching for leverage. "You restructured the constraint here," he continued, but there was hesitation now, a pause that had never existed in his speech before, and it did not go unnoticed. Clara nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, and for a moment it seemed as though she might say nothing further. But then she spoke, her voice steady, clear, carrying without effort. "The constraint only exists if you assume the boundary behaves linearly," she said, not challenging, not confrontational, simply stating what to her was obvious. The words landed differently than any argument had before, not as opposition, but as clarity, and that distinction made them impossible to dismiss. A few heads turned toward one another, the kind of silent exchange that happens when people realize they are witnessing something they did not expect to understand but suddenly do. Dr. Hayes' jaw tightened slightly, his gaze returning to the board, then back to Clara, recalculating, reassessing, but the balance had shifted too far. He could not laugh it off, could not redirect, because to do so would mean ignoring what everyone else had already begun to see. The graduate students who had blocked her view earlier now sat completely still, their earlier confidence replaced with a quiet awareness that they had misread the situation entirely. Clara took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, as if returning the stage without needing to claim it, and that single movement carried more authority than anything she could have said. The room followed her motion instinctively, attention moving with her, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer needed to. Dr. Hayes opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, echoed louder than any statement, because it revealed something no one in that room had ever seen from him before. Uncertainty. And in that moment, as the weight of realization settled across the audience, it became clear that what had just unfolded was not a simple correction, not a minor oversight, but the quiet dismantling of certainty itself, delivered by someone they had not even considered worth noticing. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the hall like a weight no one knew how to lift, and for the first time that evening, the power in the room no longer belonged to the man at the front. Dr. Hayes shifted his stance, subtle but noticeable, his shoulders no longer squared with the same effortless authority, his gaze returning again and again to the board, as if the answer might change if he looked long enough, but it did not. Clara's solution remained, clean and undeniable, quietly asserting itself without the need for defense. A faint cough echoed from somewhere near the middle rows, quickly swallowed by the stillness, followed by the soft rustle of fabric as people adjusted in their seats, not out of comfort, but out of unease, as if they were recalibrating their understanding of everything they had just witnessed. Dr. Hayes finally turned back to Clara, his expression composed, but the confidence behind it thinner now, stretched. "You seem familiar with this type of modeling," he said, choosing his words carefully, each one placed with intention, no longer casual, no longer dismissive. It was not a question, but it was not a statement either. It hovered somewhere in between, an attempt to regain control without admitting what had already been lost. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes steady, unguarded, and for a brief moment, the contrast between them was unmistakable, not in status, not in presentation, but in certainty. "I have worked with similar structures," she replied, her voice even, neither proud nor apologetic, simply factual, and that simplicity made it land harder than any elaborate explanation could have. A low murmur moved through the audience again, softer this time, but more focused, people no longer reacting to spectacle, but to realization. Dr. Hayes nodded slowly, as though acknowledging something he could not yet fully articulate, and turned back toward the board, tracing a section of the solution with his finger, this time not searching for error, but trying to understand the path that had led there. "And you are suggesting," he began, then paused, the sentence faltering before it could fully form, a rare hesitation that drew every eye in the room. Clara stepped forward just slightly, not to interrupt, but to complete the thought with a clarity that felt almost gentle. "I am suggesting the limitation was never in the system," she said, her tone calm, measured, only in how it was framed. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not confrontational, not sharp, but definitive in a way that left no space for dismissal. Someone near the front let out a slow breath they had not realized they were holding, while another leaned back, shaking their head almost imperceptibly, as if trying to process how quickly everything had shifted. Dr. Hayes lowered his hand from the board, his posture no longer that of a man presenting, but of someone reconsidering, and for a brief second, something unguarded crossed his expression, not defeat, but recognition. Clara did not press further, did not expand, did not claim the moment. She simply allowed it to exist, and in doing so, she controlled it more completely than any argument could have. The graduate students who had once laughed now avoided looking at one another, their earlier certainty replaced with a quiet discomfort that lingered in the air. Clara turned her gaze briefly toward the audience, not scanning for approval, but acknowledging their presence, and in that small gesture, it became clear that she had been aware of them all along, aware of the laughter, the dismissal, the assumptions, and yet none of it had altered her pace, her focus, or her outcome. Dr. Hayes finally stepped back from the board, creating space where he had once occupied entirely, and though he did not say it aloud, the shift was unmistakable. The room had changed, the hierarchy had tilted, and the woman who had entered unnoticed now stood at the center of a silence that no one dared to break, because everyone understood that whatever came next would not belong to expectation, but to truth. No one applauded, no one spoke, because what filled the room was not excitement, it was realization, the kind that settles slowly and refuses to leave. Dr. Hayes stood still for a moment longer, then finally gave a small nod, not to the audience, but to Clara, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the silence that magnified everything. "That is a compelling reframing," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the performance it once carried. And though the words sounded composed, they carried something unfamiliar beneath them, acknowledgement. Clara inclined her head slightly, accepting the statement without claiming it, without turning it into victory, as if the outcome had never been about proving him wrong, but simply about stating what was true. A member of the faculty in the front row leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, studying the board with renewed intensity, while another began quietly typing notes into a tablet, capturing what moments ago had been dismissed as impossible. The shift was complete now, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. Dr. Hayes turned back to the audience, his posture recalibrated, no longer towering, but grounded, and for a brief second, he hesitated, as if choosing his next words more carefully than ever before. "It seems," he began slowly, "that our assumptions deserve revisiting." The sentence hung in the air, simple, but profound, because it was not just about the equation, it was about everything that had led to this moment. Clara stepped back another pace, returning space to the stage, but the attention did not leave her, it followed her effortlessly, drawn not by demand, but by the quiet authority she had never once tried to assert. One of the graduate students who had laughed earlier finally looked up at her, really looked this time, his expression shifting from dismissal to something closer to respect, though he did not say a word. Another student leaned toward him, whispering softly, but the words were not mocking anymore, they were questions. Clara turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room, not searching for approval, but acknowledging the change, the subtle but undeniable shift in how she was seen. Near the back, where she had first stood unnoticed, the space now felt different, as if it no longer belonged to invisibility, but to possibility. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat gently, stepping aside from the board completely now, a motion that would have been unthinkable just minutes ago, and gestured toward Clara with a quiet respect that needed no explanation. "Would you care to elaborate further?" he asked, and this time, it was a real question, not a test, not a trap. The room leaned in again, but differently now, not expecting failure, but anticipating understanding. Clara paused, considering, her expression thoughtful, measured, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she might decline, as though she might simply step away and let the silence remain as it was, complete in its own way. But then she turned back toward the board, her eyes steady, and took one small step forward, not to prove anything more, but because the moment had shifted from confrontation to something else entirely. And as she lifted the marker once again, the room understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that what they were about to witness next was not just a correction, not just a refinement, but the beginning of something far greater than any of them had expected when they first saw her standing quietly in the back, unseen. Clara's hand moved again, but this time slower, more deliberate, as if she understood that what the room needed now was not speed, but clarity, and as the marker touched the board, every eye followed with a focus that had not existed before. She did not erase what she had written earlier, she built on it, extending the structure with careful precision, each line connecting seamlessly to the last, revealing not just a solution, but a framework, something deeper than a correction. "If the system is treated as adaptive rather than fixed," she said calmly, her voice steady and unforced, "the limitation disappears entirely." The words were simple, but the implication was not, and a visible shift moved through the audience as people began to understand that what they were seeing was not just an answer, but a perspective they had overlooked. A professor in the front row leaned forward sharply, his pen pausing mid-air as if he had just realized something significant, while another adjusted her glasses, eyes narrowing in concentration as she followed Clara's reasoning step by step. Dr. Hayes remained silent, but his attention was absolute now, no longer divided between performance and control, but fully fixed on the logic unfolding in front of him. Clara continued, not rushing, not hesitating, explaining just enough to guide the room without overwhelming it, allowing the structure to speak for itself. Most models fail here, she added, gesturing lightly toward a section of the board, because they assume stability where there is none. A low murmur rippled again, but this time it carried a different tone, not doubt, but recognition, the kind that spreads quietly as understanding takes hold. One of the graduate students who had earlier shifted to block her view now leaned forward so far that his notebook nearly slipped from his lap, his attention completely absorbed, while another began writing quickly, trying to capture each step before it moved on. Clara paused briefly, not for effect, but to allow the room to catch up, and in that pause, the silence felt different, not tense, but focused, alive with thought. Dr. Hayes finally stepped closer again, but this time not to reclaim space, but to share it, his posture open, his expression thoughtful, as though he were seeing the problem for the first time through her lens. "You are redefining the constraints entirely," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and there was no resistance in his tone, only acknowledgement. Clara nodded slightly, her gaze still on the board. "The system was never the problem," she replied, "only the assumptions about it." The words settled into the room with a quiet weight, and this time, no one questioned them. A subtle shift passed through the audience, people sitting straighter, leaning in, as if collectively recognizing that they were witnessing something rare, not just knowledge, but insight. Clara stepped back once more, setting the marker down gently, her role complete, but the impact still unfolding. The board now held not just an answer, but a transformation, a new way of seeing. What had once seemed impossible. Dr. Hayes stood beside it, silent for a moment, his gaze moving from the equations to Clara, and then back again, as if reconciling two versions of reality, the one he had presented and the one she had revealed. And in that quiet exchange, without a single word spoken between them, it became clear to everyone in the room that the moment had passed beyond demonstration, beyond correction, into something far more significant, a shift that would not be undone once understood. The room did not erupt into applause, because what Clara had done did not feel like something that could be measured in noise. It demanded something quieter, something more honest, and for several seconds, no one moved as the weight of understanding continued to settle. Then, almost imperceptibly, a shift began, not loud, not coordinated, but undeniable, as one person in the front row began to clap slowly, a single, deliberate sound that broke the stillness without shattering it. Another followed, then another, until the sound spread across the hall, not explosive, but steady, growing into something that felt less like celebration and more like acknowledgement. Clara did not react to it, did not smile or bow. She simply stood where she was, her expression calm, as if the reaction was not what mattered. Dr. Hayes remained still beside the board, listening to the applause, but his attention was not on the crowd. It was on Clara, and for the first time, there was no trace of superiority in his gaze, only respect, clear and unguarded. When the applause began to fade, it left behind a different kind of silence, one that felt open rather than heavy, as though the room itself had changed its expectations. A member of the faculty stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, his voice measured but carrying across the space. "That was not just a solution," he said, pausing briefly, choosing his words carefully. "That was a redefinition." Several heads nodded in agreement, not out of politeness, but because the statement matched what they were beginning to understand. Clara glanced toward him briefly, acknowledging the comment with a small nod, but she did not step forward, not take ownership of the moment in the way others might have. Instead, she turned her attention back to the board one last time, as if ensuring that what had been placed there could stand on its own, without explanation. Dr. Hayes finally spoke again, but his voice had changed, the sharp edge gone, replaced with something quieter, more thoughtful. "Clara," he said, and this time her name did not sound like a question, nor a dismissal, but recognition. Where did you study this approach? The room leaned in once more, not with skepticism, but curiosity, waiting to place her within a framework they could understand. Clara paused, her gaze steady, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the answer might be simple, expected, something that would fit neatly into the assumptions they were already trying to rebuild. But when she spoke, her words did not follow that path. I did not study it here, she said calmly, her tone unchanged, and I did not learn it the way you are expecting. A faint ripple moved through the audience, subtle but immediate, as if her answer had opened a new question rather than closing one. Dr. Hayes watched her closely, not pressing, but clearly wanting to understand, his posture open in a way it had never been before. Clara met his gaze for a moment longer, then shifted her attention back to the room, taking in the faces that had once overlooked her, the same faces now waiting, listening. Sometimes, she continued, her voice soft but carrying, when you are not given access to the system, you learn to see it differently. The words settled deeply, not as a challenge, but as a truth that could not be easily dismissed. The graduate students who had once laughed now sat completely still, absorbing the meaning behind what she had said, recognizing that her perspective had not come from privilege, but from distance. Clara stepped back from the stage then, not abruptly, but with the same quiet control she had carried from the beginning, and as she did, the space she left behind did not feel empty, it felt changed. Dr. Hayes remained where he was, looking at the board, then at the path she had taken to get there, and though he did not say it aloud, it was clear to everyone watching that the moment had shifted beyond anything he had planned. And as Clara moved toward the aisle, returning to the place where she had once stood unseen, the room did not turn away this time. It followed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she had redefined what it meant to deserve it. Clara's steps were quiet as she moved back down the aisle, but this time the space did not swallow her presence. It followed her, every movement observed, every detail reconsidered, as if the room itself was trying to reconcile the version of her they had ignored with the one they had just witnessed. Conversations did not resume immediately. Instead, there were fragments, low voices, questions forming but not yet spoken aloud. The kind of tension that comes when certainty has been replaced by something far less comfortable. Near the front, a senior faculty member leaned toward Dr. Hayes, speaking in a hushed tone that still carried enough weight to be noticed. "Do you know who she is?" he asked, and the question lingered longer than expected because it revealed something no one had considered until now. Dr. Hayes did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed in the direction Clara had moved, his expression thoughtful, almost unsettled. "I am beginning to think," he said slowly, "that we should have asked that before." The words settled into the air with quiet impact, and for a moment, no one challenged them. Clara reached the back of the hall where she had first stood, but the space felt entirely different now, no longer a place of invisibility, but of origin, the point where everything had shifted. A young woman seated nearby looked up at her, hesitating for just a second before offering a small, respectful nod, a gesture that would not have existed an hour ago. Clara returned it just as simply, without emphasis, as if acknowledging something that no longer needed explanation. At the front of the room, Dr. Hayes turned back toward the board once more, studying it again, but this time not as a presenter or a critic, but as a student, tracing the logic with a focus that had lost all pretense. "There is depth here," he murmured, almost to himself, and though the statement was quiet, it carried further than expected, drawing attention once again. A graduate student raised his hand hesitantly, his voice careful, measured. "Professor, is this approach documented anywhere?" The question hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to turn toward Clara again, even though she stood at the back, no longer at the center physically, but unmistakably at the center of attention. Dr. Hayes glanced toward her, then back to the student, and for the first time, he did not answer immediately. "I do not believe it is," he said finally, his tone thoughtful. "At least not in the way we have just seen." That answer shifted something again, subtle but powerful, because it suggested that what had happened here was not simply a demonstration of existing knowledge, but something closer to discovery. Clara remained where she was, not stepping forward, not claiming the space that had opened for her, and that choice only deepened the curiosity surrounding her. Another voice from the audience spoke up, this time more direct. Clara, have you published any work on this? The question carried expectation, almost urgency, as if the room needed to categorize her, to place her within a system they understood. Clara paused before responding, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. No, she said simply, and the simplicity of the answer created a ripple of disbelief, not loud, but unmistakable. A few people exchanged glances, others leaned back, processing what that meant, because if she had not published, if she had not presented, then where had this come from? And how had it remained unseen until now? Dr. Hayes looked at her again, more intently this time, as though trying to understand not just her work, but her path, the distance between where she stood now and where she had come from. And in that moment, the room was no longer focused on the equation, or even the demonstration, but on the question that had quietly taken its place, the one no one could yet answer. Who exactly had they just underestimated, and how much more had they failed to see? The question lingered in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the room itself was waiting for Clara to define herself in a way that would make everything easier to understand. But she did not rush to fill that silence, did not step forward to explain or justify. She simply stood where she was, calm, composed, as though the need for explanation belonged to them, not to her. Dr. Hayes finally took a slow step away from the board, his gaze shifting from the equations to the audience, then back toward Clara, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight it had not held before. Perhaps, he said carefully, we have been asking the wrong questions tonight. The statement settled deeply, not as a conclusion, but as a realization that extended beyond the moment, beyond the problem itself. A quiet stillness followed, different from the earlier silence, this one reflective, almost humbling, as if each person in the room was revisiting their first impression, their assumptions, their quiet judgments that had gone unnoticed until now. Clara glanced once more at the front of the room, her eyes steady, not seeking validation, not holding resentment, simply acknowledging what had unfolded. Then, without ceremony, she turned slightly, preparing to leave, her movement unhurried, natural, as though she had completed what she came to do long before anyone else realized it. A few people instinctively shifted in their seats, watching her, not wanting to miss the moment, though there was nothing dramatic about it. No grand exit, no final statement, just quiet departure. One of the graduate students who had laughed earlier stood halfway from his seat, as if considering saying something, but the words never came, replaced instead by a silent understanding that some moments could not be undone with language. Dr. Hayes remained still, his eyes following Clara as she moved toward the exit, and for a brief second, he seemed as though he might call out, might ask her to stay, to explain, to teach, but he did not, perhaps recognizing that whatever she had revealed could not be captured so easily. Clara reached the door at the back of the hall, her hand resting lightly on the handle, and for the smallest moment, she paused, not turning back, not looking for acknowledgement, just still. Then she stepped through, and the door closed softly behind her, the sound barely audible, yet final in a way that settled over the entire room. No one spoke immediately after, because there was nothing left to say that would match what had just happened. Dr. Hayes turned slowly back toward the board, studying it once more, but this time not searching for answers, only understanding. And the equation that had once been his now felt different, no longer a statement of authority, but a reminder of something he had overlooked. A faculty member finally exhaled quietly, breaking the silence with a single sentence spoken more to the room than to any one person. We almost missed her. The words lingered, simple and direct, and no one disagreed. Because in that moment, it was no longer about the problem, or the solution, or even the demonstration. It was about the realization that the person they had dismissed without a second thought had changed everything without raising her voice, without demanding attention, without needing recognition. And as the room slowly began to stir again, conversations returning in low, thoughtful tones, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable, that sometimes the greatest presence in a room is the one no one notices until it is too late, and by then, everything has already changed.